Okay, so with this screencast, we're going to be beginning Unit 4, Chapter 13, the Progressive Movement or the Progressive Era. So if you haven't done so already, you need to pause this screencast right now and go to Moodle and download the Chapter 13 outline. But once you have it open, we'll be ready to begin. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you the definition of, progressivism or the progressive movement. When you think of the word progress, as you see on the PowerPoint, you think moving forward or changing. Being progressive is wanting to change or take action, and that's really the mindset of this movement. The progressive movement was a movement in the early 20th century aimed at correcting social injustices, reforming government, and restoring economic opportunities for all Americans. The progressive movement had four main goals. The first of those goals was to protect social welfare. Progressive reformers worked hard to soften some of the harsh conditions of industrialization and urbanization. So if you recall, things are kind of bad, especially in the north within the cities during this era because of the results and the effects of industrialization and the overpopulation. So they want to make it more livable and more sanitary and just safe and enjoyable. So in this aspect of the progressive movement, they will form organizations like the YMCA, which, if you know what the YMCA is, it opens like libraries and has like a pool and kind of like a recreation area for people in a neighborhood to come together. Also, we see the development of organizations like the Salvation Army. So we see organizations like the Salvation Army develop at this time. And this is a volunteer organization where they would feed the poor, have soup kitchens, care for children in nurseries. They would also send people to teach immigrants and to teach the poor. So we see these two being examples of social welfare reform. The second goal of the progressive movement was to promote moral improvement. Many reformers felt that morality was the key to improving the lives of the poor. So we see things start to develop, such as prohibition. And we'll talk more about prohibition later, but prohibition is the banning of alcoholic beverages. And by promoting temperance, which is being against alcohol, and by promoting prohibition, they felt that this would improve the population's morality and benefit their way of life. So the fear with this was that, and the reason for prohibition is they feared that alcohol, the progressives feared that alcohol was undermining American morals. Okay, the third goal of the progressive movement is to create economic reform. Progressives saw problems in the workforce and aimed at reform efforts to solve them. We've already kind of talked about some of these problems with labor, harsh labor laws, long hours, overcrowding in factories, injury and then no pay for that injury. So there's all kinds of issues in the labor field, and so the progressives want to improve those conditions for the people. We have a group kind of come to the surface at this time called the Muckrakers. Muckrakers is spelled Muckrakers. And muckrakers were people who exposed the corruption within industry. One very famous muckraker is Upton Sinclair. You see his name on this book on the left with the lion. So one very well-known muckraker is Upton Sinclair. He wrote the book The Jungle, which exposed the hard times of immigrants in dealing with big business. And it also focused on the very bad conditions inside the meatpacking industry. Also, with economic reform, progressives attacked the injustice of child labor and the amount of working hours for the other workers. Okay, and the last and fourth goal of the progressive era and movement is fostering efficiency. Progressive leaders put their faith in science to make society and the workplace more efficient. One common example of this is the rising popularity of the assembly line. Time and effort could be saved by breaking down tasks into different parts and forming assembly lines. And this made production faster, and it lessened the work hours for average Americans. Okay, we're going to talk next about the different ways that the progressive movement was able to clean up government. So at this time, people are invited to question their government and the potential corruption that was in government that we had kind of previously discussed in the last chapter. So we start to see kind of the cleansing of those evils and people trying to restore a fair functioning government. One thing we see develop at this time are something called initiatives. Initiatives are bills originated by people rather than a lawmaker or congressman. Bills that originated by people rather than a lawmaker or congressman. So this is the people really taking government into their own hands, making a democracy what it's supposed to be, and you could write an initiative and via a sponsor, your initiative could be heard in Congress. Okay? Another example of the cleansing of government at this time, recalls. Recalls enabled voters to remove public officials from elected positions by forcing them to face another election before the end of their term if enough voters asked for it. So recalls, again, enabled voters to remove public officials from elected positions by forcing them to face another election before the end of their term if enough voters asked for it. If you had a public official in your state or even in your local government who wasn't holding up their end of the bargain, wasn't doing their job, and enough people lobbied for it and called for it, they could have another election before that person's term was over. And if they did not get enough votes then, they would be removed from their office position. The last example we'll talk about that comes to light at this time is the 17th Amendment. And the 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of senators. Before the 17th Amendment, people only voted for their representatives. So, for example, in this last election, we as a people would not have gotten to choose between Bill Cassidy or Mary Landrieu. That would have been up to Louisiana's Congress. We would have only gotten to vote for the local representative, not the senator. But the 17th Amendment allows the people to vote for their own senators directly, which is just restoring also democracy. Okay. Reform happening at the state level is really focused at protecting working children. Okay, protecting working children. Factories liked to hire children because they would work for lower wages and it was easy for them to handle small parts or tools. And lots of children had to work because their family needed the money. But as the amount of children in labor environments increased, progressive reformers worked to protect the children and to eliminate child labor altogether. So this is where we will begin to see child labor laws develop. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the next kind of grouping of presidents. First, Teddy Roosevelt, who's a very he's a big character. We'll talk about that. His rise to power, you don't have to write down the beginning details. I'll let you know what you need to know. But essentially, he was a Harvard graduate. He was a member of the New York State Assembly. He was then New York's police commissioner. He was a war hero in a war against Spain, and we'll talk about that later. He was also elected governor of New York, and this is when you need to start writing the notes. This is where he comes into play. He became vice president under William McKinley. Okay. Theodore, also known as Teddy Roosevelt, became vice president under William McKinley. But McKinley was only in office for about 6 months, and then he was assassinated, leaving Roosevelt as the new president. Teddy Roosevelt was viewed as a very modern president. He was very, very bold in his politics. He considered the presidency a bully pulpit. And if you think about pulpit, it's like a stand someone stands on when they give a speech to a crowd, okay, a passionate speech. He considered the role of the president a bully pulpit, where he could influence the public to shape legislation. He was very passionate about his progressive beliefs. If big business victimized workers, President Roosevelt promised that the common people would receive what he called a square deal. So he promised that the common people would receive what he called a square deal. This term, square deal, was used to describe various progressive reforms sponsored by President Roosevelt's administration. So he does lead and carry out several progressive reforms throughout his presidency. Trust busting. So if you think about what a trust was when we talked about that, he believes in busting trusts, which means breaking them apart. He became known as a trust buster because he attempted to stop trusts. We already know about the Sherman Antitrust Act, but that was not very effective. It was kind of used the term trust loosely, so it wasn't specific enough to really break too many trusts down. But President Roosevelt was successful in breaking up several trusts throughout his presidency by filing a number of antitrust suits, like a lawsuit, so a civil case. So an antitrust suit would be spelled S-U-I-T-S, okay? So he was able to break several break several trusts down through lawsuits. Roosevelt was also progressive in, also progressive in his regulating food and drugs through laws. He was particularly disgusted by the book The Jungle. He did read it. Under his presidency, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. And the Pure Food and Drug Act called for truth in labeling the ingredients in foods and medicines. Okay. Called for truth in labeling in foods and medicine. So the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt believed if people had accurate information about what was in their food or medicine, they would be able to make more informed decisions about what they're consuming. Because it had been reported that several harmful substances were existing in food and drugs before this. They would have things like alcohol and even cocaine in children's medicine sometimes. So this is going to prevent that. People are going to actually see what is in the medicines or the pills that they are being prescribed because of these labels. That's the Pure Food and Drug Act. Last note about Teddy Roosevelt as a president for now. He believed in the conservation of natural resources. He was a big outdoorsman, and he respected nature, and he didn't want Americans to think, oh, it's going to last forever if we just sit back and, kind of exploit the earth. So he wanted to kind of prevent the shrinking wilderness and prevent things like pollution. He set up several national parks and declared millions of acres of land and water to be dedicated as forest or water reserves. So he declared millions of acres of land and water to be forest or water reserves. And within these reserves, you could not farm, log, etc. They were off limits. He also established more than 50 wildlife habitations and conservation centers. Okay, the next president we're going to talk about is President Taft, William Taft. Roosevelt decided not to run for re-election, and he handpicked who should run in his place, and he chose his Secretary of War within his cabinet, William Howard Taft. With President Roosevelt's endorsement, meaning his support, Taft will easily win election in the year 1904. And when Taft secures that position as president, former President Roosevelt will then travel to Africa to hunt big game. So this just shows, again, like what kind of character he is. He just served 4 years as president now, or not fully 4, I guess 3.5, because he picked up after McKinley, but serves 3.5 years as president, and now I'm going to go hunting in Africa. Okay. When Taft is president, he is very cautious. This is actually going to go under the Republican Party splits. He is a very cautious president. He doesn't like to take sides in conflicts. He likes to remain neutral. But that is going to fuel and cause the breakup between, and a break within the Republican Party. So, to say this better, Taft's cautious nature makes it impossible for him to hold together two different sides of the Republican Party. So within the Republican Party, you have progressives who sought change, and on the other side, you have conservatives who did not. So that party is breaking into two pieces. He's not able to take a side nor act assertively enough to keep them together. So under Taft, the Republican Party will split. When Roosevelt returns from Africa, he's kind of welcomed back like a hero, and they actually encourage him to run for president again. And he will agree to do that later on. Now we're starting to see a new party develop, okay? The Progressive Party, and this was actually led by Theodore Roosevelt, okay? The Progressive Party later becomes known as the Bull Moose Party, and we'll talk about that in class because it's very funny. Bull Moose Party. For the next presidential election, though, because of the split within the Republican Party with the progressives and the conservative Republicans, the Democrats are actually going to win the next presidential election, and that their Democratic candidate is Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson will win the presidency as a Democrat. Okay, we're going to stop today. We'll talk about the colorful nature of Wilson's presidency on Monday. So that's all for the screencast. Be sure to listen to this again if you need to. And please read over your notes so we can review quickly on Monday and then wrap up chapter 13. All right, y'all have a good weekend and go Tigers.